So this is going to be the second in what I'm anticipating being a three-part series as we examine and explore the Great Flood and Noah's Ark. Now, many of you may think that the only account that we have of this worldwide catastrophic, cataclysmic flood is in the book of Genesis in the Bible. Well, in the first lesson that we looked at, we saw that in fact there are accounts of a great worldwide, in many respects, um, cataclysmic, catastrophic flood around the world in cultures literally in the four corners of the world. And so the Genesis account isn't the only account that we have. And in fact, many of these accounts all of the accounts have certain lines of similarity, and many of them have lots of different lines of similarity, like the flood being worldwide, like the fact that there was maybe a limited number of people, even just one family that survived it, like there was a vessel, obviously, that they were preserved in, like that there were animals that were brought onto this vessel to survive the ark, survive the flood, and repopulate. Well, in this particular lesson, what we want to look at is the physical evidence of a great flood. So we are going to put on um, geologist hats, and we're going to look at geology, and we're going to look at the fossil record. We're going to look at the traces and the evidences that were actually left behind by this great flood event. So let's take a look we won't be speaking directly about Noah in this particular lesson, but we are going to look at the evidence for the flood itself. Like I said, we're going to look at quite a bit at geological evidence. So again, among the lines of evidence that we have for the historicity of the Great Flood are geological features that we see around the world, literally in all the different parts of the world, not just in one part or another, not just locally in the Middle East where the account originates, but literally around the world. Now, secular geologists who don't hold to the fact that there was a worldwide flood, they predominantly will hold to a position that the standard geological column that we see, the sedimentary levels that we see in the world, and if you read textbooks, this is what you'll find. They will point to long periods of a gradual accumulation, laying down of layer upon layer upon layer. And this happens over literally millions of years, with each layer of sediment representing a long period of time, million or millions of years. And it's been that way from the beginning. And so they will call this uniformitarianism. It's been the same, uniform, all through the history of the earth. And also you'll see the word gradualism. There was this gradual accumulation of the geological features that we see, layer upon layer upon layer. One of the best examples, of course, is the Grand Canyon, where you can see the different striations, the different layers of sediment. And we're going to talk specifically about that. However, there are many geological features that we see around the world, and of course, we're going to look at some of them that appear to contradict this idea, this notion of a uniformitarian scenario, that everything being the same all throughout the history of the earth, or this gradual laying down of layers. And in fact, these many geological features, I hope you're going to agree, align better with an explanation that there was this mammoth, this large, catastrophic, cataclysmic worldwide flood that caused all of it. So what I'm going to do is share with you a couple different videos that are going to present to you um, uh, at least some of the evidence. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to give you an exhaustive laying out of the entire case, but I think these two videos will prepare you for a good argument for these geological features that I'm talking about.
God looked upon the earth, and it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Genesis 7:11. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Today, we are going to explore what is perhaps the most overlooked and definitive evidence for a time when the entire earth was covered in water roughly 5,000 years ago. But why has it been so widely rejected? By and large, the scientific community does not wish to support any theory that might support the biblical rendition of Earth's history. And they've found the perfect solution to clutch onto, and it is called uniformitarianism. This term became the foundation of the new geology. Charles Lyell, one of the founders of uniformitarian geology, held a very strict view called gradualism. These geologists prefer to think of uniformitarianism as a method which affirms that scientists can only use processes they can observe today to explain the entirety of the past. This idea is summed up by the phrase, "The present is the key to the past." Lyell wrongly convinced many people that his gradualist view of history was linked to the uniformity of Newtonian physics. Thus, geology supposedly had a status similar to physics as a science. Comparing to laws of physics, this allowed geologists to convince the public that no flood had occurred and the Earth was billions of years old. This paved the way for evolution as it required deep time in order to be accepted. Since then, the uniformitarian or evolutionary natural history has cemented itself into Western consciousness. However, geologists today have come to discover that the naturalistic view cannot explain the field data, like surface features called landforms, observed all over the planet. If anything else, this increasingly obvious failure suggests that a fresh look at the fossil record is warranted. Once the enlightenment of naturalism can be set aside, information can be readily interpreted without bias in order to support what the evidence has been trying to tell us all along, and it will support biblical history. For a great deal of people, including Christians, the narrative is quite difficult to accept. Some feel they will either ignore the science altogether or to abandon the faith in order to accept the apparent results of science. However, what we are going to reveal here is that no one needs to accept either of those alternative views, because countless geologists, oceanographers, glaciologists, and other highly qualified experts of Earth science have been stepping forward to tell us that the science actually supports a global flood and provide what they believe to be the mechanisms that were behind it, and it all aligns extremely well with the details we can extract from the Bible. Because the flood was global, Genesis provides a global mechanism for explaining sedimentary layers and landforms of all scales in a uniform manner. However, studying present-day observations we have on local levels of floods of various intensities can give us clues to how the global flood would change the land. From what we read in the Genesis account, we can clearly see that it is parallel with the stages of a flash flood on a much grander scale. A flash flood rises rapidly and retreats slowly. This corresponds with Genesis, as it states the flood waters rose and covered the earth sometime between 40 to 150 days. It is clear the first 40 days were the most vigorous. It records, "All the fountains of the abyss were broken up, and the floodgates of heaven were opened." These powerful forces would have been extraordinarily violent. Hence, we would expect a rapid rise of water and much geological activity. This first phase of rapid rise is called the eruptive phase. The second is the ascending phase, where the water rose more slowly. The third phase is peak levels of flood, called the zenithic phase. This could have lasted anywhere from just 1 day up to 60 days. There are 2 stages in the retreating phase of the flood: the abative or sheet flow stage and the dispersive or channelized flow stage. This is the wide currents that began draining the floodwater off the continents soon after day 150. At that point, there would have been few to no mountains and plateaus showing above the floodwater. During the abative, continents rose while the ocean bed sank, allowing the water to flow down and creating today's oceans and seas. It is the catastrophic effects on the geology that we will take a look at now. Here, I present the scientific argument for how sedimentary rocks and fossils are powerful evidence for the Great Flood. We will be looking at the biblical timescale created by Dr. Tasman Walker and explain a number of important geological features. The eruptive phase would have been accompanied by tremendous tectonic and volcanic activity. It is hard to imagine this level of destruction. If there were meteorite or comet impacts, they would have only added to the devastation. In this phase, we would expect intense, large-scale erosion with tremendous power to dislodge rock, break it into fine particles, and pulverize organisms. In many locations, turbulent, violent currents would have been so powerful that instead of depositing sediments, they scoured the land. Particles from the size of clay to the size of boulders were torn up and carried into calmer waters where they temporarily settled, only to be moved when the enormous energy of currents increased again. Deep basins, enclosed by higher areas and rifts, would have provided ideal sediment traps during the eruptive phase. These deep basins and rifts filled rapidly with sediment and volcanic products as the currents lost some of their energy within the rift. The top of deep currents generally move faster than at the bottom. The basins and rifts were likely formed in the first few days and weeks. This includes the North American Mid-Continent Rift. A rift is a deep, wide crack in the rocks. This particular rift is over 2,200 kilometers long and extends from central Kansas to Lake Superior, then southeast to central Michigan. It is 40 to 70 kilometers wide and up to 32 kilometers deep. It is almost totally filled with sedimentary and volcanic rocks. Lake Superior lies on top of it and slightly obscures the fill. The sheer size of the lake provides a glimpse into the immensity of the mid-continent rift, as well as the power of the flood to vastly change the surface of the earth. In addition to the erosive and depositional power of moving water, tectonic upheavals would move the crust mostly up and down. It may have affected parts of the mantle in places. Any meteorite impacts would have added to the chaos, and almost expected to occur given the severity of his judgment on the earth. Meteorites would have destroyed large areas of the crust and left behind craters or basins with raised rims and sometimes central uplifts. The pulverized crustal rock would be ground up by turbulence and deposited in the deep basins and rifts. This would explain some of the ancient impact craters in the world, such as Algidgitkin in Siberia, Chicxulub in the Yucatan Peninsula, and the Manicouagan in Quebec, and so many more. Following the violent eruptive phase, which probably lasted 40 days, the ascending phase of the flood began. Although the water continued to rise, its violence waned and the rain tapered off. This is similar to a local flash flood. The decrease in current velocity allowed the widespread depositing of sediments over the continental surfaces, including the Great Unconformity. We call this episode the Great Deposition. The vast amounts of sediment, mostly being held in suspension by turbulence, began to settle and become deposited in sometimes significant thicknesses. These can be up to several hundred or even thousands of meters thick, with little tilting or faulting. In addition, the changes in water chemistry, temperature, and salinity resulted in chemical deposition of great beds of carbonates and other dissolved chemicals, such as salt. These sedimentary rocks on the continents today average 1,800 meters in thickness. This provides evidence of a catastrophe of great magnitude, not slow processes over millions of years. The Grand Canyon reveals 1,220 meters of nearly undeformed, flat-lying Paleozoic rock. North of the canyon is the Grand Staircase. It is left over from the vast erosion of about 3,000 meters of sedimentary rock that once covered the top of the canyon. The sedimentary rocks in the staircase are dated as Mesozoic and are also essentially undeformed from when they were first deposited. Before the Grand Canyon was cut, there was about 4,270 meters of sediment that had quickly turned into sedimentary rock. This is a sign that the area at one time was covered with deep water and slow currents with very little turbulence. This is very significant since these layers are claimed to have been deposited over hundreds of millions of years. If that were true, the rocks would have been cut up by the stream and other forms of water erosion. The Grand Canyon itself was cut out much later after the flood, when a massive lake broke free and drained westward along the Colorado Plateau, rapidly carving out the canyon we see today. We've observed this process in 1980, when water and mud carved out the Little Grand Canyon in just a matter of hours. In it we see similar layers of strata along the inner walls, cut down from the surface to its base, deep in the valley. So, how was all this sediment hardened into hard rock in the strata we find all over the world? The thick accumulation of sediments would rapidly become compacted because of their weight. Being filled with water, the compaction would cause the expulsion of water under high pressure. The migrating water would have been chemically charged and introduced various cementing agents into the sediments, which would have hardened quickly into what we see today as sedimentary rock. Like we see today when mixing concrete, rock particles soon become like stone. These cementing agents include silicon dioxide and calcium carbonate. This resulting stone cannot be explained by the simple millions of years erosion. Next up is the zenithic phase. This would have lasted a very short time, perhaps only hours. This is the highest level of water during the flood. We only know that this phase would have caused the most intense amount of pressure on the deeper layers of the earth below. Since little else can be said about it, we move on to the retreating phase. This phase begins with the sheet flow stage, in which erosion of the continents would have been widespread. There would have been little continental sedimentation taking place, but most of what did occur would have been near the current coasts, like the Gulf Coast near Texas. As present-day ocean beds began to sink, floodwater would begin to move toward them to fill, causing the continents to rise and become exposed. Wide sheets of water flowed, carving the land with incredible force. As the levels of water reduced, the sheet flow decreased into broad channels, focusing increasing erosion power in narrow zones. As it continued to retreat into the final phase of the flood, the channels continued to narrow, further focusing erosion. Here we see the creation of water channels and rivers. Many of these still flow today because, as the hydrologic cycles were being created, their very own sources of water continued to feed these channels. Water levels continued to decrease until a point of equilibrium was reached, where water levels stabilized and remain to this day. The Earth holds a volume of water sufficient to cover the entire planet, but can we find evidence that the ocean floors actually sank with a combination of continental lift to trigger the sheet flow phase in clearing the continents? Indeed, there is. Geologists have found global signatures. The entire Earth's crust displays evidence of vertical tectonic rise and fall. This is seen most clearly in the study of landforms, which is the field of geomorphology. Landforms can come in the form of features like mountain ranges, plateaus, or gorges. One stunning piece of evidence is the existence of great faults which moved mountains upward and sank adjacent basins. Another global signature is these basins are filled with the thick accumulations of sediment that cemented into sedimentary rock. Granite crust is one example. The sum of the upward and downward motions of the granite crust in places like Wyoming reached a height of 13,700 meters. The entire stretch of the Rocky Mountains shows similar movements to similar heights. Geologists have been able to measure late flood erosion by examining the thickness of rock eroded from domed uplifts. Another method was to measure the height of landforms that are remnants of an eroded landscape, like the towers of Monument Valley in Arizona. These are only minimal estimates since we can only see what remains, not was there originally. This is especially true of erosional remnants like Devil's Tower in Wyoming. An average of 2,500 to 5,000 meters of rock was eroded from the entire Colorado Plateau. That's 337,000 square kilometers wiped away. Multiply that with the eroded thickness, and we get a total volume of 330,000 to 660,000 cubic kilometers that was stripped from this region. Simply incredible. Millions of years of slow erosion and deposition should present where this would be deposited, but geologists have not found the missing sediment anywhere near its source. Instead, it appears to have been swept off the continents. This could only require a very powerful force of nature to accomplish. Here is the most profound evidence. Rocks vary significantly in their hardness and resistance to weathering and erosion. The Mohs hardness scale, or MHS, is a simple way of classifying this difference for minerals based on whether they can scratch each other. On this scale, the very soft mineral, talc, registers as a 1, while the hardest mineral on Earth, diamond, is classified as a 10. This difference in hardness played a large part in preserving certain rocks, especially in the erosive late stage of the flood. The incredible power of rushing water disintegrated much of the rock matter. Softer rocks would have been pulverized to clay, silt, and sand. Harder rocks, however, would resist destruction more easily and would be carried for long distances by powerful currents, being rounded rather than destroyed. Therefore, we should expect to find hard, rounded rocks of large size that show evidence of transport over long distances, much farther than any modern stream, river, or glacier from the Ice Age that could carry them. The flood model predicts this, and that is exactly what is found in the rock record. All over the world, hard rocks are found carried hundreds of kilometers from their nearest sources. They typically range from gravels to cobbles, and sometimes even boulders. The fact that they're mostly well-rounded indicates that it was water that transported them, just like the rounded rocks observed in a river. In two locations, in Idaho and Wyoming, hard quartzite rocks reach thicknesses of 4,575 meters, and the top of the deposit shows an evidence of erosion that suggests they were originally even thicker. Quartzite is a hard metamorphic rock formed under intense heat and pressure during deep burial. Thick layers formed in the western Rocky Mountains, such as 600 meters of bedded quartzite observed north of Challis, Idaho, have been uplifted, eroded, and transported as far as Manitoba, 1,300 kilometers away, while others have been found to be transported westward to the Pacific Ocean, 640 kilometers away. No rivers that we know today could carry these rocks such distances. Scientists can estimate the velocity of a flood current from the size of the rocks the current transported. Heavy rocks like the quartzite gravels, cobbles, and boulders would require very energetic currents. This is reinforced by the presence of percussion marks on many of the rocks. These are caused by one rock impacting another in a violent, turbulent current. Since quartzite is one of the hardest rocks in the world, tremendous turbulence would be required to generate the kinds of impacts that would leave such marks and cracks on their surfaces. Such marks do not form today on these rocks, not even in flash floods or boulders carried over waterfalls. Calculations show that these marks require currents moving at over 160 kilometers an hour. In comparison, the notorious Bidwell whitewater stretch of the Chilko River in British Columbia flows upwards to 15 to 20 kilometers an hour. One final piece of evidence we will address here is the coal seam formation. Coal is compressed plant matter that was heated and transformed into mostly carbon. This is compressed under hundreds of meters of sediment. They were likely formed by destroyed plant matter and log mats in massive quantities that combined together as collective assemblages and buried under overwhelming sediment. Continued burial would raise temperatures high enough to turn this matter into coal. Only the flood had the power to strip vast amounts of vegetation from the land and accumulate it in thick layers, followed by quick burial before it can decay. If the flood never occurred, why do we have vertical walled canyons rather than V-shaped walls? We have planation surfaces, Inselberg erosional remnants, and the insufficient talus at their feet. Landforms that show rapid and intense erosion, the rapid excavation of valleys, offshore submarine canyons, and so much more. Join me next time, where we move forward in the Old Testament to Joseph's rule and Israel's settlement in Egypt.
So now I'm just going to show you a second video. This one's only about 5 minutes or so. Just going to kind of give you a summation of a handful of evidences.
If the flood really did occur, what evidence would we look for? You know, most people haven't even thought of that question, let alone thought of an answer. You know, the Bible says that the fountains of the great deep were open, the rain fell from heaven for 40 days and 40 nights, the waters rose 150 days until all the high hills under the whole of the heaven were covered and the mountains were covered. And we're told that all land-dwelling, air-breathing life perished except for those on the ark. Wouldn't we expect to find billions of dead plants and animals buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth? And that's exactly what we find. Billions of dead things called fossils buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. But let's expand on that. Let's look at 6 of the best evidences for the flood. Evidence number 1, sea creatures buried high in mountains on the continents. That's right, marine creatures that live in the ocean are found in mountains like the Himalayas. How did they get there? Unless the ocean waters rose up over the continents. And we find marine creatures in rock layers all over the continents, everywhere around the world. Evidence number 2. We'd find rapidly buried plants and animals. Well, we do, fossils. We find fossils not only of plants, but of bees, of bats. We find fish that haven't finished having their breakfast, eating another fish, they're buried and fossilised. Ichthyosaurs giving birth to babies and they're fossilised. We find delicately preserved fossilised jellyfish. How do you fossilise a jellyfish slowly? Evidence number 3, rapidly deposited sediment layers right across the continents. We find that everywhere we look. Look at the Redwall limestone, full of fossils in the Grand Canyon, yet the same limestone layer is found in the same position over in Pennsylvania, then over in England, and even in the Himalayas. The chalk beds The White Cliffs of Dover. We find the same chalk beds in Europe, in the Middle East, over into Kazakhstan. We find the same chalk beds with the same fossils in Texas and the Midwestern United States. We find the same chalk beds in Western Australia. The coal beds of Pennsylvania and West Virginia are also found in England and Europe, right across to the Ural Mountains. Evidence number 4, long transport distance of sediments. The Coconino Sandstone in the Grand Canyon. The sand grains are believed to have been eroded and washed from as far north as at least Wyoming. The Navajo Sandstone in Zion National Park, those huge white cliffs, the sand grains are believed to have been eroded and washed all the way from the Appalachians right across North America. Evidence number 5, rapid or no erosion between sediment layers. Again, think in terms of the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Shale. There's a knife-edge, flat, featureless boundary between those two rock layers for mile after mile through the Grand Canyon. Yet the geologists claim that there's 10 million years missing at that boundary. What would have happened during 10 million years of weathering and erosion? You'd get a topography, not a flat, featureless boundary. The bottom of the Grand Canyon, the Tapete Sandstone sits on the pre-flood rocks, and we have evidence of huge erosion there, with boulders being picked up from the underlying rock layers indicating rapid erosion. Evidence number 6, we find whole rock layer sequences deposited rapidly in quick succession. Look at the walls of the Grand Canyon, from the Tapetes at the bottom to the Kaibab limestone at the top, supposed to be representing 300 million years of slow and gradual sedimentary deposition. When the plateau was pushed up, those rock layers were bent and folded, but they were folded without fracturing. They had to be soft if they were bent without fracturing. That means that they could only have just have been deposited. But that means the 300 million years never happened. All those rock layers had to be rapidly deposited in quick succession during the flood year. So you see, when you ask the right question, you get the right answers. Who are we going to believe? The scientists who weren't there, who don't know everything, who sometimes make mistakes? Or the Word of God who was there, who saw what happened and told us what happened during the flood? And what we see in God's world agrees with what we read in God's Word.
I just want to summarize and go over a few things, mostly things that were presented in one of the 2 different videos. One of them is what he was really just speaking about, and that is the folds that we find in the geological record. If these layers of sedimentation that were hardened into rock or were rock to begin with were laid down gradually, one layer upon another, over a period of millions of years, you wouldn't see actual folds as we do see, because again, if something were to fold like that was hardened rock, it would crack. It wouldn't fold and have a shape as if it was soft when it was bent. And that is, in fact, what we see. And we see these kinds of rock formations all over the world. And that kind of confirms the fact that the Earth did undergo some kind of a watery event, a cataclysmic flood. If these layers were laid down over a shorter period of time, and obviously the force on them bent them before they had hardened into rock, then you, of course, would see these folds without cracks. And so since we do see that, it is consistent with a catastrophic flood event. Now, he talked about the Colorado River, and of course, there are many different theories about how this occurred, but of course, the secularist who is purporting or holding to a uniformitarian or a gradualistic viewpoint would tell us that the Grand Canyon was formed by the Colorado River slowly but surely kind of grinding its way through the different layers, or maybe saying that a glacier formed it at some point. But The important thing is to determine whether something like this could even possibly have been formed in a short period of time, i.e., such as a massive amount of water, which, as we know, can produce a massive amount of force that kind of carved its way through there quickly, not through millions and millions and millions of years. Well, indeed, this is just a picture from a textbook, and it is from the 1990s. But I would be very surprised if we opened up a textbook today. And I'd be surprised if we didn't see something very, very similar to this, and that is a picture of the Grand Canyon, and captioning it or describing that this was formed over millions of years by the Colorado River kind of carving its way through there. And so this is what our children and our grandchildren are taught. And of course, I will admit, this is what I was taught. This is what I understood decades ago when I was going to school. And of course, if you go to the Grand Canyon now, you will hear the park ranger describing that the Colorado River carved its way through these sediments of rock over a period of millions of years. However, as the first video pointed out, we have seen evidence of a canyon being formed very quickly by a destructive force, particularly of water and sediment. And this is when Mount St. Helens blew in 1980. We saw what the force, a powerful force, can do through rock, and how it can form a canyon, lay down layers, and in fact create a formation that resembles, although not in size and scale, but it shows how something that would, in this case, Mount St. Helens, would be a fraction of the force that was evident in the biblical flood. But again, even that the force that we saw from Mount St. Helens carved out what we see, basically a small canyon, if you will. And so there is what remains at the base of this canyon formed by Mount St. Helens is a river. And so, some secularist or gradualist might have not know, if they didn't know about Mount St. Helens, would look at that and say, well, that little river carved its way through that canyon. Well, it didn't. And what I am suggesting, and what, again, the evidence suggests, is that small Colorado River did not carve its way through all that rock to form what we find at the Grand Canyon. Now, there is also evidence of fossils, and this was touched upon. We know that fossil formation requires a sudden burial under massive pressure, and that it can't be disturbed. Now, if gradualism or uniformitarianism were true, obviously it would be difficult to find fossil beds, if you will, where numbers and numbers and numbers of formerly living organisms were suddenly and catastrophically buried together. Animals just don't perish that way. And so what we see, however, in the rock formations is billions of dead things that seemingly, obviously, the evidence would suggest were laid down by water all over the earth, because we see these fossil formations literally, again, at every corner of the globe. One of the most fascinating ones is this fossil bed in South Africa, where we actually see a huge bed of fossils all together that include a mixture of marine creatures like whales and seals and sharks. And they're in the same fossil bed. We see elephants, antelope, and other predators, even birds. And so the fact that they were all obviously catastrophically suddenly buried together would be a real task for the evolutionists to answer how that would happen, or the gradualist. Evolutionists will challenge those who believe in the flood to say, if there was this global flood, well, then where are these large beds of fossils of mixed animals? Well, here's an example where they did find exactly that. Another interesting feature, and this was mentioned in the second video, is the fact that we see fossil evidence. We see marine fossils at the tops of mountains, even the tallest mountains in the world, even in the Himalayas. Now, how could a marine fossil, some organism or creature that lived in the sea and yet was fossilized at the top of the highest mountains? Clearly, the evidence would suggest or even dictate that the tallest mountains in the world at one point or another were all underwater. Obviously, that would speak to a catastrophic worldwide flood. And then finally, one other thing, I don't think this was necessarily mentioned, but there are polystrate trees. This picture, what you'll see, you can see that, of course, here are all the different sedimentary levels, and in the middle is a fossilized tree going across all these layers. Now, the gradualist would suggest that all these layers, that in each layer took, or there was a gap, or it represents millions of years. And so how did a tree get fossilized in the middle over millions of years? Clearly, that is not something that you would see. And the fact that we do see all over the world, this is not unique to one area. We see all over the world these fossilized trees spanning multiple layers in the sediment, in the geological column, if you will. And so if these strata had been laid down over millions of years, this tree in this particular picture would have decomposed long before it got buried by succeeding layers of sediment. So what this points to is a large-scale, rapid burial in a short period of time. And so that's what speaks to the sedimentary levels taking a short amount of time to pile up. Bottom line is that there is evidence all over the world that supports the belief, the account in the Bible about the great flood that we see described in Noah's day, thousands of years ago. The generally accepted mechanism of the history of the geological column, the gradualism, the uniformitarianism, it, of course, would take long periods of time to accumulate. But the problem with that theory or that position is that there are features, again, all over the world, not limited to one area or another, but literally all over the world, that mitigate against this uniformitarian or gradualistic position. Mountain formation, the seabed formation, which was spoken of particularly in the first video, some of the rock features, the erosion features, sediment formation, including, as we talked about, the folds, the fossil formation, their locations, the polystrate, the trees that cross the different sediments that would obviously speak against the fact that it would have taken millions of years to form. And then coal formation, which was referred to in one of the videos, and how that forms is best explained by something that was rapid, powerful, and a short amount of time compressing that organic material and creating the coal beds that we see. And so the fact is that believing in the account, believing what Genesis says about the great flood and Noah's Ark, is not to believe in a myth or a child's fantasy. We have indeed a great deal of physical evidence that indicates that the biblical account of Noah's flood and the great flood is not only accurate, but it is consistent with what we actually see in the world. So I hope this has been helpful. Again, I know this has not been exhaustive. I would invite you, I would suggest to you that you look further into it. There is a video series called Is Genesis History? Is a very good one. You can find it on YouTube. And we'll give you a lot more detail in terms of the things that I've tried to present today. I'm going to do one more video in this series, and this one we're going to look at the ark itself. We looked at the accounts of the flood around the world. We looked at the physical evidence for a catastrophic flood in this lesson, and in the last one we'll actually look at the ark and the evidence for it. So I hope that you will look for that video. So thanks for watching this, and God bless you.